Former Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane had been working as a security consultant in San Diego, California, for 16 months since leaving the Navy SEALs. At 39 years old, Marcus hadn't retired due to physical injury or catastrophic mission failure. He left because after 14 years of operations across multiple theaters, he witnessed a military working dog named Valor get declared unmanageable and euthanized after developing severe aggression issues following a traumatic combat incident. Marcus had advocated passionately for Valor's rehabilitation, citing the German Shepherd's 8 years of exemplary service and the clear trauma triggers causing the behavior changes. Command decided the liability risk was too high. Valor was destroyed. Studies showed that military working dogs were euthanized for two primary reasons: veterinary conditions causing unnecessary suffering, or because the animal posed an unacceptable risk to public safety. In 2023 alone, 18 military working dogs were euthanized, with some destroyed for failing to maintain standards, welfare reasons, or being an unacceptable risk to safety. Research on military working dog mortality revealed that behavioral reasons accounted for a small but significant percentage of euthanasia cases, particularly among dogs that experienced combat trauma. Marcus requested retirement rather than continue serving in a system where highly capable warriors, human or canine, could be discarded when they became difficult instead of receiving the intervention their service had earned. Now Marcus lived in a small beach house in Coronado, taking security consulting contracts that paid well but felt hollow, maintaining deliberate distance from the SEAL community and anyone who knew Valor. He carried the dog's ID tags in his pocket as constant reminder of the cost of giving up on those who'd earned better treatment. On a grey February morning when ocean fog blanketed San Diego, Marcus received an unexpected call from Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, an active-duty SEAL officer he'd served with during 2 deployments. "We have a situation with a military working dog," Sarah explained with urgency in her voice. "Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, call sign Havoc. He was part of a SEAL team that got hit hard during a compound raid in Syria 3 months ago. His handler was killed in the initial breach. Petty Officer Martinez, you might have known him. Havoc sustained shrapnel injuries, was extracted under fire by the surviving operators. Since then, he's been problematic, shows extreme aggression toward handlers, won't engage in training protocols, exhibits behaviors our MWD specialists classify as unmanageable. Command wants him euthanized as a liability. But I remember what you said about Valor before you left. Would you be willing to assess Havoc before we put him down?" Marcus agreed, despite knowing that unmanageable military working dogs usually had trauma-based reasons for their behavior, reasons that took months to address properly, not the quick evaluation Sarah was offering. He drove to Naval Base Coronado and was escorted to the kennel facility where high-risk military working dogs were housed separately from operational animals. Inside a reinforced isolation kennel with double fencing and warning signs was Havoc, approximately 75 pounds of pure muscle and fury, exhibiting every sign of severe reactive aggression that made handlers nervous and command officers sign euthanasia orders. Belgian Malinois were prized for military working dog programs because of their high energy, exceptional sense of smell, trainability, agility, speed, work ethic, loyalty, and controlled ferocity when needed. The kennel supervisor, a master chief with 20 years of MWD experience named Rodriguez, provided the detailed background. Havoc completed 4 deployments with 0 behavioral issues. Best detection dog in his class. Multiple confirmed saves. We're talking dozens of IED detections that saved operator lives. Then his handler, Petty Officer Martinez, got killed during breach entry. Havoc was in the tactical stack behind Martinez when the explosion hit. Dog took shrapnel to his left side, got extracted under fire by the surviving team members. Since then, he's been completely unapproachable. Bit too experienced handlers who tried to work him, required medical treatment, destroyed 3 kennels trying to escape, shows constant aggression posture, won't eat consistently, exhibits what our behavioral specialists call combat trauma response beyond rehabilitation parameters. Every MWD expert who's evaluated him, and we're talking people with decades of experience, says the same thing. Too damaged, too dangerous, liability risk too high for operational use or adoption. He's scheduled for euthanasia in 72 hours. Research on military working dog deaths showed that traumatic injuries were common causes of mortality, with 77% of deployed MWD deaths due to trauma from IEDs and gunshot wounds. Dogs that survived combat trauma often exhibited behavioral changes that were difficult to manage. Marcus observed Havoc for 30 minutes without approaching the kennel, using techniques he'd learned during years of working with combat dogs. What he saw confirmed suspicions based on his experience with Valor. This wasn't a vicious dog exhibiting natural aggression. This was a highly trained military working dog experiencing severe PTSD, manifesting as defensive aggression. The constant pacing was hypervigilance, a classic PTSD symptom. The aggressive displays toward handlers were trauma responses. Havoc's handler died despite the dog being present. The dog was injured during the same incident. And now every human approach triggered associations with that catastrophic failure to protect. The lack of food motivation suggested chronic stress shutting down normal biological drives. This dog wasn't unmanageable. He was grieving and traumatized in ways that looked like aggression, because that's how working dogs communicate acute distress when the mechanisms that regulated them, their handler, their routine, their purpose, get destroyed. Marcus made a decision that required confronting exactly what he'd left the SEALs to avoid. I'll take him. Give me 2 weeks. If I can't demonstrate measurable rehabilitation progress, you can proceed with euthanasia. But this dog earned better than being destroyed because he's traumatized from watching his handler die. Rodriguez and Sarah exchanged skeptical looks, communicating their doubt. Marcus, this dog has bitten trained handlers with years of MWD experience. Our behavioral specialists, people with decades of working with military dogs, say he's beyond rehabilitation given the severity of his trauma responses. What makes you think you can do what they couldn't? Rodriguez asked. Marcus's answer was simple and devastating. Because I watched you put down Valor when he exhibited the same trauma responses after his combat incident, and I've spent 16 months knowing I should have fought harder for him instead of accepting command's assessment. I'm not walking away from another warrior who earned intervention instead of execution. Sarah authorized a 2-week evaluation period with strict protocols. Marcus took full legal liability for any incidents. Havoc remained under naval supervision with mandatory daily check-ins, and any aggressive incidents triggered immediate termination of the evaluation and proceeded with euthanasia. Marcus accepted the terms and did something that shocked everyone present. He entered Havoc's kennel directly. Rodriguez moved to stop him. Standard protocol explicitly prohibited entering kennels with aggressive MWDs classified as dangerous. But Marcus was already inside, moving with calm deliberation born from years of working with combat dogs in operational environments. Havoc immediately exhibited threat displays, aggressive barking at high intensity, lunging toward Marcus while maintaining distance. Classic defensive aggression from a dog whose training said, "Protect your operator," but whose trauma said, "Everyone is a threat now because the last person you trusted to protect died." Marcus didn't advance or make threatening movements. He sat on the kennel floor with his back against the wall, hands visible and relaxed, making no direct eye contact. Classic non-threatening posture designed to communicate no hostile intent. Then he did something unexpected. He began speaking to Havoc, not commands, but conversation. "I know, brother. Your handler died, and you couldn't stop it. Everything's felt wrong since then. Every person who approaches reminds you of failing to protect Martinez. Every training scenario feels pointless because the mission that mattered most, keeping your operator alive, failed catastrophically. You're not broken. You're grieving. And grief in working dogs looks like aggression because you don't have words to explain that you feel like you failed the one job that defined your entire existence." For 20 minutes, Marcus sat without moving while Havoc maintained defensive positioning and aggressive displays. Then, gradually, Havoc's body language shifted. The aggressive barking decreased in frequency and intensity. The lunging became testing rather than attacking. The dog's posture lowered from active threat to cautious assessment. At minute 23, Havoc made a choice that shocked everyone watching through the observation window. The Belgian Malinois approached Marcus cautiously, sniffed him thoroughly for several seconds, and then, in behavior Rodriguez later described as unprecedented given the dog's recent history, Havoc lay down beside Marcus with his head resting on the seal's leg. It was submission without coercion, trust without force. A traumatized warrior recognizing someone who understood that aggression is sometimes just grief that has no other language available for expression. Marcus was authorized to take Havoc off base to his Coronado beach house under strict supervision protocols requiring daily documented check-ins with Naval MWD Command. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus applied techniques that violated every standard MWD rehabilitation protocol documented in military manuals. He didn't force training exercises, didn't demand immediate obedience, didn't try to correct Havoc's trauma responses through traditional behavioral modification. Instead, he provided consistent, non-threatening presence, maintained absolutely predictable routines that allowed Havoc to anticipate what would happen next, allowed Havoc to engage at his own pace without pressure, and most critically, treated the dog not as broken equipment needing repair, but as a combat veteran experiencing PTSD that required patience, understanding, and time. PTSD symptoms in veterans commonly included hypervigilance, severe anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and detachment. symptoms that manifested similarly in military working dogs who'd experienced combat trauma. The progress was remarkable but deliberately slow, respecting Havoc's need to rebuild trust. By day 4, Havoc accepted food regularly, without the stress-induced appetite suppression that characterized his first weeks. By day 7, the Belgian Malinois responded to basic commands without aggression or defensive posturing. By day 10, Havoc demonstrated controlled behavior around Marcus that resembled his documented pre-trauma working capability. By day 14, the dog exhibited behaviors that everyone said were impossible given his recent history. Calm engagement with training scenarios, controlled aggression on command rather than reactive violence, and most significantly, the return of purpose-driven focus that defined elite militaries. Working dogs. On evaluation day, Marcus brought Havoc to Naval Base Coronado for formal assessment by the behavioral team and command officers who'd authorized the euthanasia order. What they witnessed shocked them profoundly. Marcus and Havoc conducting advanced detection drills at operational tempo, controlled aggression exercises demonstrating precise targeting and tactical scenarios. The supposedly unmanageable dog performing at levels that matched or exceeded his documented pre-trauma capabilities. Rodriguez's assessment was direct and incredulous. This is the same dog that bit 2 experienced handlers and destroyed 3 reinforced kennels trying to escape. How is this transformation possible in just 14 days? Marcus's answer defined everything about his approach. It's not about 14 days of training. It's about approaching trauma as something requiring understanding and patience rather than correction and force. Everyone treated Havoc like broken equipment, showing aggressive malfunction requiring repair or disposal. I treated him like a combat veteran experiencing PTSD that manifested as defensive aggression, because that's the only communication available to working dogs when their world falls apart and the person they trusted most dies. You can't train PTSD out of someone, human or canine. You prove through consistent, non-threatening behavior that safety exists again, that trust is possible, that purpose can be rebuilt. Then the trauma symptoms decrease naturally because the survival responses aren't needed anymore when the environment stops triggering the original trauma. The evaluation concluded with official cancellation of Havoc's euthanasia order based on demonstrated rehabilitation progress. But Command faced a new operational problem. Havoc wouldn't work with any handler except Marcus. Every attempt to reassign the Belgian Malinois to other experienced handlers resulted in immediate reversion to defensive aggression and refusal to engage in training. The Navy's assessment was clear. Havoc had bonded specifically to Marcus through the trauma rehabilitation process and was effectively unavailable for operational deployment without him as handler. Sarah presented Marcus with an option he never expected: return to active duty as Havoc's handler. The Navy needs dogs with his capabilities. His detection record is exceptional. His operational experience is irreplaceable. And he clearly needs you as handler. You could come back, continue the work you started, prove that rehabilitation works for traumatized MWDs, and give Havoc the operational purpose he was trained for and still clearly needs. It was everything Marcus walked away from 16 months ago. The same system that destroyed Valor without attempting rehabilitation. The same command structure that prioritized liability assessment over loyalty to warriors who'd served with distinction, the same operational tempo that created trauma in both operators and dogs, and then discarded those who couldn't immediately recover. But it was also the opportunity to change that system from inside, using havoc as living proof that unmanageable often just meant traumatized in ways that require patience instead of policy, understanding instead of administrative efficiency. Marcus made a decision that required trusting the judgment and system that had failed valor. I'll return to active duty on one non-negotiable condition. I lead the development of a comprehensive trauma rehabilitation protocol for combat MWDs. If we're sending dogs into situations that break them psychologically, we owe them systematic rehabilitation rather than administrative euthanasia when they become difficult to manage. Havoc proves rehabilitation is possible when approached correctly. Make it official policy with resources and training, and I'll come back. The proposal faced significant institutional resistance. Command argued that individual rehabilitation programs were resource-intensive, that not all traumatized dogs would respond like Havoc, that liability concerns remained when working with dogs exhibiting trauma responses. Marcus countered with data. Havoc's successful rehabilitation in 14 days using minimal resources. The military's investment in each MWD exceeding $150,000 in training costs. The operational experience lost when combat-proven dogs were euthanized for behavioral issues that might respond to trauma-informed intervention. The parallel between discarding traumatized MWDs and the military's historical pattern of inadequately supporting human veterans with combat PTSD. Sarah advocated for Marcus's proposal at command levels, citing Havoc's transformation and the potential to prevent future euthanasia of combat-experienced MWDs exhibiting trauma responses. The turning point came when Marcus presented Havoc's case study to Naval Special Warfare leadership, including detailed documentation of behavioral changes, video evidence of the dog's current operational capabilities, and testimony from Rodriguez acknowledging that traditional approaches had failed where Marcus's trauma-informed methods succeeded. The Navy accepted Marcus's condition after extensive deliberation and bureaucratic review. He returned to active duty as both Havoc's operational handler and the lead developer of the Naval Special Warfare Canine Trauma Rehabilitation Program, a formal initiative designed to identify and treat PTSD in military working dogs systematically rather than defaulting to euthanasia. Over 18 months, Marcus created comprehensive protocols for identifying trauma responses versus genuine aggression requiring different management, training handlers to recognize PTSD symptoms in working dogs, establishing assessment criteria for rehabilitation potential, and implementing the principle that combat dogs experiencing trauma deserved the same intervention commitment the military provided to human operators. The program faced initial skepticism from traditional MWD handlers who viewed behavioral issues through correction-based frameworks rather than trauma-informed approaches. Marcus conducted training sessions demonstrating that what appeared as unmanageable aggression often indicated treatable psychological injury when handlers understood trauma triggers and response patterns. Havoc became the program's proof of concept and primary demonstration asset. The Belgian Malinois completed 2 additional deployments with Marcus over 18 months, demonstrating that rehabilitated MWDs could return to full operational effectiveness when paired with handlers who understood trauma and maintained consistency. More importantly, Havoc's documented successful rehabilitation prevented the euthanasia of 17 other military working dogs exhibiting similar trauma-based behavioral issues over the following 2 years. These dogs, including German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Dutch Shepherds exhibiting aggression, handler avoidance, training refusal, or hypervigilance following combat incidents, were assessed through Marcus's protocols and provided rehabilitation rather than administrative euthanasia. Statistical analysis showed that 82% of dogs identified as rehabilitation candidates through the new protocols returned to operational or adoption-ready status within 3 to 6 months, compared to the previous policy of euthanizing dogs classified as unmanageable. The program's success attracted attention from other military branches and law enforcement agencies seeking to reduce euthanasia rates for working dogs exhibiting trauma responses. 3 years after entering that kennel where Havoc waited for euthanasia, Marcus and Havoc participated in a major military working dog conference attended by handlers, veterinarians, and behavioral specialists from multiple services and allied nations. They demonstrated rehabilitation techniques that emphasized patience, consistency, trauma-informed assessment, and recognition that behavioral changes following combat often indicated psychological injury rather than permanent aggression requiring euthanasia. During the presentation, Marcus was asked the question everyone wanted answered. You entered a kennel with a dog that had bitten trained handlers and was scheduled for euthanasia in 72 hours. That violated every safety protocol in MWD handling. Why take that risk when every expert said the dog was beyond rehabilitation? Marcus's answer became foundational doctrine for military working dog trauma protocols adopted across multiple services. Because I watched the Navy euthanize Valor when he exhibited the same trauma responses after his combat incident, and I left military service rather than accept that we discard warriors who become difficult after we break them through the work we ask them to do. Havoc was labeled unmanageable because his grief and trauma manifested as aggression, the only communication available to dogs who can't explain in words that watching their handler die destroyed their ability to trust new handlers. Entering that kennel wasn't reckless disregard for safety protocols. It was just honest recognition that unmanageable usually means traumatized in ways that look like aggression to people who approach trauma as a training problem instead of a psychological injury requiring different intervention. What I did wasn't shocking or heroic. It was just refusing to repeat the mistake I made with Valor by walking away when intervention was harder than execution. Military working dogs invest their entire lives in service. When that service breaks them, we owe them the same rehabilitation commitment we provide human operators. Anything less dishonors their service. The presentation included detailed protocols for trauma assessment, case studies of successfully rehabilitated dogs, and comparative data showing reduced euthanasia rates while maintaining operational readiness standards. 4 years after Havoc's rehabilitation, Marcus received recognition from the Secretary of Defense for developing programs that fundamentally changed how military services approached behavioral issues in combat-experienced working dogs. The Naval Special Warfare K-9 Trauma Rehabilitation Program became mandatory training for all MWD handlers across services, reducing behavioral-based euthanasia by 67%. While maintaining operational safety standards, Marcus also began consulting with veteran organizations developing service dog programs, applying lessons from Havoc's rehabilitation to help traumatized veterans and traumatized dogs heal together. What I learned from Havoc applies equally to human veterans, Marcus explained during veteran advocacy presentations. Trauma isn't weakness. Aggression is often just pain that doesn't have better language. When we approach trauma with patience instead of judgment, understanding instead of correction, most warriors, human or canine, can rebuild purpose and effectiveness. The key is recognizing that healing takes time, that setbacks don't mean failure, and that loyalty means not giving up when someone becomes difficult. 5 years after that February morning phone call, Marcus and Havoc retired together from active duty. The Belgian Malinois, now 10 years old, had completed 6 total deployments with documented success that exceeded his pre-trauma operational record. They returned to Marcus's Coronado Beach house, but now Marcus carried 2 sets of MWD tags, Valor's tags as reminder of the cost of giving up, and Havoc's tags as proof that warriors deserve intervention when service breaks them. The wild canine everyone said was untameable proved that sometimes the most shocking intervention isn't force or technical expertise. It's willingness to sit on a kennel floor with a grieving dog and acknowledge that elite warriors don't stop being valuable when trauma makes them difficult. They just need someone who remembers that loyalty, capability, and years of exemplary service don't get erased by PTSD, manifesting as defensive aggression. That the most dangerous thing about traumatized military working dogs isn't their teeth or their training. It's the certainty with which people who've never experienced combat trauma decide that suffering warriors are liabilities requiring elimination rather than psychological injuries requiring intervention and patience. Proving that sometimes doing the unthinkable just means refusing to think that euthanasia is easier than sitting with someone's pain until they remember that safety exists, that trust is possible, that purpose can be rebuilt, and that the warriors who served with distinction deserve rehabilitation rather than disposal. When the service that defined them leaves wounds that manifest as behaviors we find inconvenient or frightening, until someone has the patience to understand that aggression is often just grief that doesn't know how else to express, that the world stopped making sense when everything that mattered was destroyed in a single moment, and every subsequent moment has been just trying to protect against experiencing that level of loss again.